All right, guys. So this is going to be your second part of this section's review sheet or review video. So this section focuses more on the theory of evolution. Okay, we talk about Darwin, talk about his ideas. Okay, so with the theory of evolution, okay, we need to talk about how this all came about. So Charles Darwin in the year 1830, he sailed around the world in a ship called the Beagle. Okay, to be more specific, let me get that out of there. The HMS Beagle. Now, in his trip around the world, he visited a lot of places, but the most famous place he visited was the Galapagos Island. And what he looked at there is he saw what are known as Darwin's finches. And these finches, he went to about 13 different islands, and all these islands had a slight variation of the finch. Now, what he said is there has to be some mechanism in place that caused all these finches to have slightly different beaks. And what he noticed was that they all have adapted or changed to eat a specific food source. So some were more of seed eaters, some were bug eaters, some used tools. So his theory of evolution was based on this trip around the world, and he was convinced that groups of animals varied from island to island, as well as he became convinced animals changed over time. So evolution is this idea of change over time. Now, another way that he put it was descent with modification. Now, descent with modification is a process of evolution, and every species, every species must have come from pre-existing species. Pre-existing. And from these pre-existing species, they must be able to change over time through reproduction. So in other words, descent with modification is, so we have this, I guess how you want to put it, we have this colony of, green and red or orange beetles. Now, the birds only like the green ones, so they start picking them off. Now this population of beetles goes from all green, mostly green, to mostly red, because that is the trait that is most likely to survive. Now, natural selection, in other words, the traits, don't want to do that, traits best suited for survival will be passed on. So in other words, if you are very good at surviving, you're going to reproduce and you're going to produce more offspring. So descent with modification and natural selection really is the mechanism of evolution. The traits that are best suited for survival will be passed on to the next generation. Now, Darwin had a bunch of reasons for why he came up with this idea of evolution and how organisms evolve over time. The first one was overproduction. In other words, animals produce a large amount of offspring. Now, these offspring, for the most part, usually they produce more than are going to be able to survive. Now, if we look up here, the tarantula will lay up to 500 to 1,000 eggs. Now, there's no way that 500 or 1,000 tarantulas will survive to adulthood, but in other words, they're stacking their deck. If they can produce a large amount in hopes that only 5 survive, then they get 5 that'll be able to go on to the next generation. So they also do genetic variation. It was another one of his ideas. And in other words, you want to produce offspring with a wide range of traits. And you do this for one reason. The more different traits you have, the better chance that one of them will have an adaptation that will allow it to survive the best. So in other words, every individual has its own combination of traits. Each transition is similar but not the same. That slight variation is what leads to change in the next generation. Okay, next one, number 3, struggle to survive. Now, in the struggle to survive, nature is ruthless. Okay, an individual or an animal must find a way. An animal must find a way to survive. In other words, if they don't survive, they're not able to pass on their traits, their genes are killed. So the ones that are best successful for surviving are the ones that are going to be able to move on to the next generation. So for example, you see up here, this wasp and this tarantula are both struggling to survive. If the wasp gets into the tarantula's nest, it will eat all its babies. If the wasp fights it off or the wasp get killed, then his traits are not able. So in other words, there's two sides of this. If he's bad at getting into the nests, he's not going to be able to survive. If she is bad at defending her nest, they won't be able to survive. Okay. Now, final, successful reproduction. In other words, producing offspring that can survive and reproduce. Offspring that survive and reproduce. So in other words, it's not just good enough to produce a lot of them. You need a lot of offspring that can survive to adulthood as well as reproduce in their adulthood as well. So these 4 points right here, okay, these are the 4 reasons that Darwin came up with that evolutionary theory. So a lot of times he uses the phrase survival of the fittest. Now what fittest means is pretty much the best individual, the best ability, I guess is a good way to put it, a best ability to survive and spread genes, or spread genes. Okay, so if you are considered a fit individual, you are somebody that reproduces a lot, somebody who is able to produce offspring that reproduce a lot, the fitter you are, the more offspring, the more chances you have of spreading your genes. Now, adaptation and acclimation. So animals adapt to their surroundings, but adaptation is a very long process. So that is change in a population. Now, this change in population is a long-term, very long-term. So in other words, it's something that you pass on to the next generation, as in some mutation or thing like that. Whereas acclimation is a short-term change. So in this case, like for example, the Arctic fox in the summertime, he's white. Okay, an Arctic fox in the he's not white in the summertime. He is brown. Okay. He's brown in the summertime. Now, in the winter, to blend in, they change to white. So this is a short-term acclimation to their surroundings. Now, these next couple slides are pretty much the big, the big backbone of Darwin's thing. And these were the evidence that he came up with for evolution. Now, most of the evidence we have comes from what's known as the fossil record. Now, the fossil record, it shows us how animals have changed and evolved over time. And we look at this through something called transition species. And these species, they're species with gradual changes. So gradual changes, or a gradual changes in the form or structure of the individual. Now, all of these individuals have traits of the one before it and the ones of it after. So think of it like, so here is, one, it evolves to this species that has, I don't know, let's just say he has a line going through it, okay? So then it goes to here, okay? Now it's still similar, but we're adding piece by piece, okay? Going here, okay? Maybe the color is purple now. And then finally, we go to an all purple individual. So again, slight changes from number 1 to number 5, but each one has characteristics. That's what transition species are talking about. Now, the one they talk about are the horse and the dawn horse, right? Here's our modern horse. Here's our early ancestry of the horse. Now, you see there's slight changes that are both, related to the one before and the one after. That's what we refer to as transition species. Now, homologous structures are there are similar anatomic structures in different species that show evolutionary common ancestry. So in this picture, we have a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. Now, what homologous structures shows us is, okay, we have our our humerus, which all vertebrates have. They have this simple bone structure. We have our radius and ulna in every single one of them. We have our carpals. We have our metacarpals and phalanges. So what you want to see here and what you should be looking at is each of these animals all have the same bone structure. Now, they are slightly different depending on their function. So what this shows us is that vertebrates, what this shows us here is that vertebrates, they all came from a common ancestry, okay? Even though they have evolved to change over time to different species, way back millions and billions of years ago, there was one common ancestor, okay, that we can trace all the way back to show why there are all of these similarities between what we have. Now, the next one is analogous structures. Now, analogous structures are a little bit different. Analogous structures, you'll notice that each one of these, okay, the fin of a shark, the fin of, or the wing of the penguin, or the fin of the dolphin, each one of these is used to help in swimming. Now, evolutionarily speaking, the shark, the penguin, the shark, the penguin, and the dolphin are not closely related. So they're not related. But what happened is, because they are all of these animals swim, they've evolved similar characteristics. So this is kind of like one of those things, like, even though they are similar, they're not related because they haven't derived from the same common ancestry. They evolved because they all swim. Now, embryology is pretty cool in my opinion. So embryology, what it shows is that some stages of development are very alike. And this shows development from a common ancestor. So this should be from a common ancestor. Now, if we look here, we notice that if we just look at that first early stage, you notice that all of these organisms develop very similarly. So, over time, they obviously change a little bit. So, individuals with a backbone, okay, all of them start development the same way. So, this, again, shows common ancestry. So, even humans have phalangeal slits. They have a tail, okay? So, they look the same as all these different organisms, but as they evolve, you can tell, like human, calf, even humans have a tail when we start. So at the end, they're all different, but at the beginning, embryo is something that shows common ancestry, okay? Again, I thought that's always pretty cool, just having kids guess what that embryo is from. Now, another one we have is biological molecules. So, in other words, the more DNA, the more amino acids an organism shares, the closer they are related. Now, I stole this from 23andMe. Okay, this is a website, kind of measures your chromosomes. So, in other words, humans and chimps, they share 98% of DNA. So, obviously, humans and chimps are very closely related. Now, a mouse shares about 92. So, if we look at this, a plant shares about 18, yeast 26, fruit fly 44. So, we are more closely related to mice than we are fruit flies because we share more DNA in common. Okay? The more DNA you share, the closer you are related. Or the closer you are to that common ancestry that we talked about. Now, evolution or new species form in different ways. So, convergent evolution is not when we form new species, but we have two separate species. And they evolve similar characteristics because they are, forming analogous structures. So convergent evolution, process by which unrelated species evolve similar characteristics. They all have fins. Now, even though they're not related, they've evolved to show similar characteristics because of the conditions they are in. Now, divergent evolution is when we have one species that splits into two new species. So here we have this original mammal right here. Again, gets to this point and splits into two different species. It gets to this point and splits into two separate species. Splits. Divergent, single species splits into two separate species. Now, adaptive radiation is most likely what occurred in the Galapagos Islands. We have what's known as a founder species. And a founder species is pretty much just the first species into an area. Now, adaptive radiation is when that founder species comes to a new area, it will diverge all parts of the ecosystem to kind of fill all of them. So, one species comes in, let's just say it's my bird. I'm going to draw a bad bird here. Okay? Now, what happens is, this one eats nuts. This one lives in a tree. This one lives on the ground. Okay, so in other words, they start filling all of these different ecosystems and we form a bunch of different species. So adaptive radiations, we start with our ancestry groundfinch, and what happens is they all split to form or fill all the different niches in an ecosystem. Now, artificial selection has everything to do with human selection. So, artificial selection, human guides the evolution. We pick the traits we want. So, for example, our wolf, what happened is 15,000 years ago, humans started breeding that for the traits they want. And what happens is when they breed it, they're breeding for characteristics they find desirable. And this one wolf now goes into hundreds of different types of dog breeds, all from the same DNA set. So we choose the trait. And it also happened in corn. Corn was just almost like a weed-like. We breed the biggest, the strongest, and we get what we have modern corn today. Now the final one is coevolution. Now coevolution, two or more species have evolved adaptations to teach others, or two or more species have evolved adaptations to each other's influence. So this should be to each other's. Okay, and in other words, I have two different ones here. I have this moth, and as you can see, this moth has this really long snout. And what that evolved to was get inside of this flower right here. So again, they evolved to each other. So the flower got bigger, the moth had to get bigger. Now the same thing with this guy over here. This finch has evolved to fit inside and drink the nectar of that orchid. Now again, this isn't good for much else, but it's perfect for fitting inside of that flower. So this is your evolution video. Hopefully this helps you out. This is Mr. O'Brien signing off.